So you have to have some tolerance for uncertainty, right? So that's where I come out on this, that the only long-term way to accommodate people of different religious persuasions is to have free debate and free inquiry. And that may mean that more religious conservatives have a place in the public arena, and they're going to be vocal. They're going to try to push their ideas, and those ideas are going to be scary. But their role has to be protected. They should not be repressed. Just as people who have a very secular view, who want to see less of a role for religion, their rights should also be protected. But that can only happen in the context of democracy and democratic competition.
All right, great, Shadi. Well, thank you again so much for coming on. To start, can you just give us a little bit of your background, and up until the point of when you started researching and writing about Islamic issues?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I think one key moment for me, and this is probably a good place to start, is 9/11. And I was a freshman in college when it happened. So here I am living away from home for the first time, trying to figure out the person I want to be and all that kind of thing. And then about 3 weeks into my time at Georgetown, 9/11 happens. And I think that, as an American Muslim, in some sense, it was a tragedy on two levels. First, as an American, but then also as a Muslim, that here were people who claimed to be Muslim, and they were doing these horrifying things in our name. So I think that those were things I had to process early on. And that became quite formative in that it pushed me, it politicized me in some sense, and it pushed me to focus more on the Middle East. I think when I started college, I probably wanted to do something relatively normal, maybe with an international flavor, but I didn't really have this ambition to be a researcher, writer, or academic necessarily. But 9/11, I think, brought out a lot of questions that I began to contend with. And I think one of those questions was, why is the relationship between the US and the Middle East so messed up? Something has gone fundamentally wrong here. And I wanted to understand what that something was. And part of it for me was the issue of authoritarianism. And I sort of knew intuitively that, so I'm born and raised in Pennsylvania, but I'm originally Egyptian. And I lived a year in Egypt when I was younger, and I would spend summers there with my family. And I knew that Egypt was an authoritarian state, that there was a dictator who was in charge. So I had this sense that authoritarianism was part of the problem facing the Middle East. But then I started to look at why the US wasn't doing more to support democracy. Why were we still propping up these authoritarian regimes that had been bad for the region for decades and had contributed to this dysfunction and chaos in the broader region? And that's what led me to ask another question, which was, why are we afraid of democracy in the Middle East? And we support democracy in theory as Americans, but we don't necessarily support it in practice because we're afraid of who might come to power through free and fair elections. Who are those people? Islamist parties. And that's really what led me to focus more and more as I got older on groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements and parties that tended to do quite well in elections when they had the chance.
Oh, interesting. So what were you studying when 9/11 happened and you started to have this shift? And then what did you study after that as a result of your change?
Yeah, so I started, I hadn't really decided on my major yet, but it was going to have something to do with international issues. I think that I was leaning more towards international business or international economics at first. Then 9/11 pushed me much more in the direction of politics and U.S. foreign policy. And then I did my master's in Middle Eastern studies, so a very kind of more focused approach to understanding dynamics in the region. And then I did my PhD later on in political science, but my dissertation was on the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan. But I started actually studying the Muslim Brotherhood in a serious way in 2004, 2005. I got a Fulbright fellowship in Jordan, so I spent about 9 months living in Amman, Jordan. And my project was really to just kind of hang out with members and leaders of the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood and to interview a lot of them and to try to understand what does this group stand for, what do they believe in. And I think that my approach from that relatively early age was to really try to immerse myself. When I'm trying to study something, I don't want to look at it from afar. I want to really dive in and actually talk to the people involved. So if you want to understand a controversial group like the Muslim Brotherhood, you can't just read their statements or press releases or documents from the US. You got to go and actually talk to them. There's no, I think, substitute for that. So that's what I did. And it was kind of weird. I think I must have been 21 when I started in 2004. And they were kind of confused, like, who's this American grad student who's so focused on us? And I think I was actually the only Western researcher living in Jordan at that time, focusing on the Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. So I think at first they were suspicious, but then they were like, well, someone cares about us. Okay, this is kind of cool that someone was actually paying attention to them. And Jordan is a country that doesn't tend to get as much attention as, say, Egypt. And I think that they came to find that intriguing, that, here's this guy about us. So that's sort of where it started for me in terms of this particular focus.
And didn't you also spend more time in the Middle East as well?
Yes, I also lived in Egypt at different points after that, and I was, and then after that in Qatar. So those were the three main countries that I lived in the Middle East. When I was younger, I also lived in the UAE for about 2 years. Yeah.
So I'm really happy to have you, because what we do here is we pick the minds of those who have immersed themselves in topics that we don't know much more, we don't know much about, so that we can broaden our own horizons and brains. I know that I know very little about the situation in the Middle East and the religion and politics of Islam. So, like most topics, I'm going to be coming at this from a beginner's mind. So it's great to talk with someone who's been studying this for so long and so deeply and close to the situation as well. I'm going to ask you mostly about the views in your book, Islamic Exceptionalism. And I know that you like to explain the process of how you came up with the title, and particularly the use of the word exceptionalism. Can you explain to our viewers that process and how you came up with that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the first thing is that wasn't the original title. I'm not even sure I want to mention what the original title was, because it was kind of lame. But I changed it at the very last moment. I had a conversation with a colleague, and he encouraged me to be more upfront about my argument. And the good thing about a title like the one I came up, like that I ended up with, is that the argument's right there in the title. And I think that I came to the conclusion that I really wanted to own it instead of kind of putting it to the side or diluting it. So the argument, the brief idea, just to start, is that there is something exceptional about Islam. Now, all religions are different in some way. Otherwise, what would be the point of having different religions? But I'm talking about a specific kind of difference in terms of how Islam relates to law, politics, and governance. So what this means in practice, but also historically, is that Islam has proven to be resistant to secularization. Islam has and continues to play an outsized role in public life. And I think going forward, at least for the foreseeable future, it's going to be hard to privatize Islam the way Christianity became privatized in large parts of the West, and particularly Western Europe, and some parts of the U.S. as well. But the reason that I like the word exceptionalism is because it provokes different reactions. Some people hear it and they think that something exceptional means that it's other. It's something to almost be feared, but other people might associate the word exceptionalism with American exceptionalism, so it has a more positive connotation. I think it's a fairly value neutral term, and something exceptional can be good in some ways and bad in other ways. And what I try to do in my book is to look at both the good and the bad of that. And one thing I want to do, certainly, I think, is to challenge Western audiences and to push them away from this notion that religion playing a central role in public life is automatically a bad thing. It's not necessarily. And I think for those of us who grew up in the secular liberal elite bastions in the US, DC, New York, San Francisco, wherever, when we think about religion in public, we think that this is negative. But that's not actually the experience of many people of faith throughout the world. For them, they want to be able to express their deeply held beliefs in the public arena in some way. Now, this tends to happen more in the Middle East, but I think it also happens to various degrees with Christian evangelicals and Orthodox Jews in the US. So I think all of us as Americans, even if we don't experience it that much directly in our everyday lives, we know that there are people who don't want to just keep their faith private. And I think it's sometimes problematic when American liberals tell people like, oh, you can be religious, that's great, but keep it to yourself and don't let it affect your political views. But that's a non-starter for, let's say, many, if not most, Christian evangelicals on an issue like abortion. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at this. And I think what I really try to do in the first chapter of the book is to kind of lay out these big concepts and these big ideas and to kind of push people outside of their comfort zone to some extent. Another part of it is if Islam is not like Christianity, if Islam is distinctive in some way, that means that Islam will not follow the same trajectory that Christianity followed several centuries ago. So this kind of linear trajectory of Reformation, followed by Enlightenment, followed by secularization. And I think that there's sometimes this attitude when we talk about the Middle East is to say, well, you Muslims are having trouble over there and look at all the violence and all of this, but don't worry, we Christians went through that three or four centuries ago or whenever, and we got over it, and don't worry, you guys will get over it too. It's just a matter of time. But that's kind of patronizing to assume that a different religion and a different faith community is going to almost, in a sense, copy the way Christianity did things. I mean, that's very presumptuous. So there are a number of presumptions and assumptions that I think are held. Maybe people don't even realize they're holding them. But a big part of my work, I think, and my book was a part of this, is to challenge those assumptions.
So I understand that there's some historical context that might be necessary in understanding the current state of Islam and Islamic politics, just even in modern day, like the last century that you talk about in your book. Is it, again, you guide me, you're the expert here, but is it correct in saying that you talk about the fall of the Caliphate in 1924? Would you say that was a good triggering or starting point?
Yeah, sure. So if you take my premise that Islam plays this outsized role in public life, then the challenge, if we want to fast forward to the modern era, is how do we accommodate Islam's role in public life? If you agree with me that Islam can't be privatized in the same way that Christianity was in, say, much of Western Europe, then what do we do about Islam, right? And I think that 1924 is such an important date for me when I try to understand developments in the Middle East, and actually more broadly, is because, for the better part of 14 centuries, from the 7th century until 1924, in some sense, there has always been at least one caliphate. Sometimes there were competing caliphates. But then 1924 represents this formal breach where subsequently there is no longer a kind of representative of the so-called Islamic Ummah or the Islamic nation or the Islamic community. And ever since 1924, I would argue, there has been this ongoing struggle to establish a legitimate political order in much of the Middle East. There's been a vacuum ever since then. And what Muslims have been fighting over to a large degree are these very foundational and existential questions over the appropriate role of religion in public life and the relationship between Islam and the state. And then also you can think of it, the state and Islam. And that is an ongoing set of questions that remains to this day unresolved. So even if we fast forward even further to the Arab Spring, why did the Arab Spring start off with such optimism and then devolve into chaos, conflict, and polarization? One main reason is that Egyptians, Yemenis, Libyans, you name it, they couldn't come to an agreement over the appropriate role for Islam and Islamic law. And there were people who were so afraid of the public role of religion that even when Islamist parties did well in elections and came to power, and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is the main example of that, that they supported ending the democratic process because they wanted to maintain some kind of secular state identity. And I think that you can't understand the 2013 coup in Egypt without understanding how Islamists on one hand and secularists or liberals on the other hand came to see each other as in some sense enemies. And a large part of that had to do with, well, they said that they're all Egyptians technically, but being Egyptian wasn't enough because they didn't agree on what it meant to be Egyptian. And part of that had to do with religion.
Can we actually dive even deeper into these highlights, historical highlights? Can I even ask, like, what specifically is a caliphate, and how exactly did the caliphates fall in 1924 during this time?
Yeah, sure. So maybe along with caliphate, I should also probably define Islamist. The way that I define this, and I think most academics do as well, is Islamists are those who believe that Islam and Islamic law should play a central role in public life. That's the first part of the definition. The second part is, and then they organize politically around that goal, because there are many ordinary Muslims who believe in some application of Islamic law. That doesn't automatically make them Islamists unless that is their conscious political identity. So that's one. Now, caliphate, the first caliphate, we go back to after the death of Prophet Muhammad, and the caliphates are basically the successors to the prophetic state. So this actually goes back to part of the exceptionalism argument that Prophet Muhammad, unlike, say, Jesus Christ, was not just a man of religion. Prophet Muhammad wasn't just a theologian or a cleric. He was also a political figure. He was also a statesman. He was also a head of a proto-state in Medina, which is in what is now modern day Saudi Arabia. And he was also a state builder. So this has major implications for how Islam evolves from its very founding moment, because if the early Muslims are contending with questions of how to govern, because they got to deal with a state, right? Then the Quran naturally has to say something and include verses and chapters that deal with politics and public law and governance. On the other hand, if you take the New Testament has very little to say about public law and governance. Why? Because Jesus wasn't dealing with questions of governance. Jesus was a dissident against a reigning state. And after Jesus died, and then Christianity developed in its formative years, the early Christians didn't really have a chance to govern either. They were living as minorities under largely Roman law. And it was only several centuries later that Christians actually could govern themselves, right? So because of that, the New Testament is not going to be focused on governance. So that's very key. And when we talk about governance, this leads back to your question about the caliphate, is that these caliphates had a kind of religious and moral and legal authority that was very closely tied to Islam and Islamic law. And Islamic law, or what is called Sharia, even though Sharia as an Arabic word goes a little bit beyond the narrow Western conception of law, but it's still a rough translation, that these were states where Sharia imbued every aspect of public life. And you had local courts that made judgments according to Islamic law. Another example that is one of the obvious ones is that public alcohol consumption was restricted, even though people did drink privately. And there was an interesting division in the early caliphates between the private and public realm, that the public realm was seen as having as having a kind of religious importance, because if you do something publicly, that affects other people in your society. On the other hand, people should be able to do what they want in the privacy of their own homes. But anyway, these various caliphates were not secular, obviously, and as I mentioned, Islam played an important role in various ways, and that continued more or less until I would say the 19th century. Then we start to see reforms under the latter-day Ottoman Caliphate, where under pressure from the Western world and with the new ideas of secularization and classical liberalism being introduced, there were Turkish officials and Turkish leaders who tried to, in some sense, secularize, not completely, but introduce some secular elements into the Ottoman Caliphate. Then we can fast forward a little bit. The Ottoman Caliphate could have continued, but then World War I changes things. Then after the conclusion of World War I, we see a kind of Turkish nationalism building up, and there's a new Turkish nationalist leader who was playing an important role at the time, named Ataturk. And then Ataturk was quite secular in his approach, and very, in some sense, aggressively secular, where he wanted to essentially depoliticize Islam and really replicate the French model of aggressive secularism. And that leads ultimately to the formal abolition of the caliphate in 1924.
I've heard you give a couple talks when you talk about the time, 1924, you just mentioned how significant it is, and you've even pointed out that I guess some people in the audience, you're like, yes, some people are nodding their head because they understand how significant that time was. There like a particular event or something that happened that made people so respond to it so specifically?
Well, that's just a kind of joke that I do sometimes when I give public talks, because it's impressive if people know what 1924 symbolizes. So it's almost a way to kind of test the crowd. It's also a way to kind of joke about whether a crowd is very old, because, well, if you have like a very old crowd with a bunch of people like with white hair, it is theoretically possible that they were still alive that they were alive in 1924. It's getting harder now because I guess you'd have to be like 96 or something. There's just a kind of joke that I do, but if but most people most American audiences are not usually familiar with what happened in 1924. That said, in the Middle East, if you talk to people in the region, they might have a sense of what happened in 1924, but still, it seems like a really long time ago, right? So, yeah.
So what was the outcome of that? Because I imagine if the efforts for secularization were effective enough that there actually was a fall of the caliphate, that there was some that it was effective in a way. I mean, were people drawn to that? Were they looking for a change, or was it more of a forceful situation? I guess what was the result of that?
So certainly some of it was a forced secularization. So in the case of Turkey under Ataturk, there was elite buy-in into this idea of let's become more like the West. But these elite sensibilities didn't necessarily spread to the rest of the country. And this is still at a time when levels of higher education are quite low. Literacy was still relatively low, and that was one of the major initiatives in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s was to rapidly improve literacy. But you did have this very stark divide between elites in Istanbul versus people who were living in the countryside of Anatolia. So I think when we talk about secularization being successful in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was, but only up to a point because there was always a limit to the popular buy-in. We also see this in Egypt, especially under the Nasser regime in the 50s and 60s, where Nasser was a secular, sort of somewhat socialist leader who was extremely popular. And my parents grew up in part under the Nasser regime before they, and then the Sadat regime, and then they immigrated. But Nasser, people like Nasser because he was a nationalist leader who made Egyptians proud of being Egyptian. So that part is certainly true. But I think, again, there was a limit to the idea of Western secularization if you go into the more rural parts of Egypt at that time. So, and then there was also repression. We don't know. There were probably hundreds of thousands or millions of people who were uncomfortable with aspects of secularization, but they couldn't really express that publicly because these were authoritarian regimes that did not allow for any kind of significant dissent. And that's why we have to be careful of assuming that a forced secularization can be true secularization, because anything that is forced is not really an organic part of society. And that's why we see, I think, later, after you remove the forced secularization, people try to return to their religious identity. And we see a religious revival really spreading throughout the Middle East, starting in the 1970s and then gaining strength in the 80s and 90s. And that happens even in the most secularized of the Middle Eastern countries, which is Turkey. And also Tunisia was another country that experienced decades of forced secularization. But once you have the removal of the secular dictator, what do Tunisians do in 2011? They vote for an Islamist party.
So is this why sometimes you'll see past images of people in the Middle East? I don't know where exactly, but wearing bikinis on the beach or something in like the 50s, 60s, and then you probably wouldn't see that so much today, and Iran and countries like that.
Yeah, certainly. I think it's a common trope, if you will, to kind of say, well, look, in the 50s and 60s, we have these black and white pictures where people seem free and liberated and women are wearing bikinis and swimsuits and all of that. It's all true. And I think that, we should take note of changes that happened over time. But I think sometimes it's sort of presented in, again, this kind of patronizing way of why can't Arabs go back to the way they were in the 50s and 60s, almost treating that period as an ideal point, right? But again, was it ideal if people were suffering under repression? You got to look at the broader picture. This was not some kind of golden liberal age. This was an age of fear, of repression, of authoritarianism, and also of failure. And 1967 represents a kind of turning point in a way, where you have Arab armies being defeated by Israel in the famous Six-Day War. And this marks a kind of a failure of a system that people were attempting to build in the 50s and 60s. So it doesn't lead to great outcomes, right? And again, I think that there's an elite bias here, that a lot of the pictures that you see are more secular elites, well-educated people in the capital cities, and we're not talking about the broader population. I mean, if you go to the countryside of Egypt, you're not going to see people wearing bikinis. That's something that you're going to see in the port town of Alexandria or in Cairo, in the major urban centers. It is interesting though, and I've talked to my parents about this. So my mom, she was born, I think, in 1957. Yeah. And then, she tells me that when she was growing up, it was very rare to see a woman covering her hair. That was just like a weird thing. Then she starts to notice it more when she enters college in the 1970s. She starts to see that some of her classmates are putting on the headscarf. And it's no mistake that it's happening at that time, because as I mentioned, the 1970s see this kind of religious revival where people are trying to reconnect with their faith and bring their faith more into the public arena, and wearing the headscarf was one way of expressing that. So there are these really important changes that my parents, witnessed in real time, that I think that if you're under 40 or under 30 and you're living in the Middle East, you don't really remember a time when the headscarf was rare, because now in at least most Arab countries, the headscarf is quite common, if not the significant majority of women wear the headscarf. So that is definitely real. And if we want to use those black and white pictures to capture what was really in some ways a striking shift, then that I think is useful. That said, if we want to look at the broader sweep of history, that moment of secularism or secular influence in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I tend to see that as an aberration, that was the exception that proves the rule. And if we look at the broader sweep, we're just talking about a few decades over the centuries, So I think that if we put it in perspective, can we really say that was the natural future that the Middle East was going through? Clearly, it wasn't the natural future, because it didn't end up sustaining itself over time, and there was a reversal back to a more religiously oriented identity.
When you talk about repression going on during that time, are you able to provide some examples of how it was that maybe did make people want to go back to a more religious, traditional culture?
Yeah, well, so when it comes to repression, we have the case under the Nasser regime. The main victims of repression were the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. And the Muslim Brotherhood was driven underground, and many of its leaders were either in prison or in exile. Some were executed in the 50s and 60s under Nasser. And so, sometimes you might hear people say, well, when they're trying to explain why extremism came about in the modern Middle East, that you have to look back to the dungeons and prisons of Gamal Abdel Nasser, because in prisons, that's where many people were radicalized, because people had to survive in very difficult conditions, and there were also incidents of torture that happened in these prisons. And there is some academic literature about how torture and very high levels of repression can really push people to go over the edge and to consider violence or extremist methods. So that's part of, I think, the broader story. So that's certainly part of it. But when we talk about why people wanted to return to religion, I mean, one way of looking at it is if we look at the late 1940s, the Muslim Brotherhood was the largest movement in Egypt. So there were estimates range from 500,000 to 1 million Egyptians were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And at that time, Egypt was about 20 million. So that's like a massive proportion of the overall population. And for an organization that had that many people to be driven underground in the 1950s, that's a very incredible shift in a very short period of time. Then if we fast forward to 1967 and the failure of the Six-Day War, people start to question and say, well, Nasser promised that we would become this great united Arab nation and Arab nationalism and all these ambitious ideas. of fighting Israel and becoming strong and becoming proud to be Arab, but then to have such a humiliating defeat after all the hype of the Nasser era, that was such, people couldn't get their head around it. And that's what provoked a lot of soul searching. And it took time to really take hold. But we see this soul searching from really 1967 into the 70s, into the 80s, that people are still struggling to understand what went wrong. And there's actually, there's a famous book by Bernard Lewis, which captures some of this, called What Went Wrong, ? But that is a question that I think I even grew up with in Pennsylvania, in the Arab community that I was a part of there, that you would have these dinner table conversations. And I talk a little bit about this in my book, that where, if dinner goes long enough, at some point you're going to have a conversation about, oh, we used to be this great civilization. We have this great history that we're proud of as Arabs and Muslims. But then we try to make sense of how we went from those moments of greatness, of scientific, philosophical, technological advancement to what we are today. And that's kind of devastating. It's hard to kind of, it was a precipitous drop. It was a precipitous drop, because if you look at the Middle East right now, we kind of suck. I mean, to kind of put it in stark terms, and that's very hard to deal with. If you have a memory, a historical memory, or a historical knowledge of these great empires and these great caliphates that we all learn about when we're growing up and when we're reading books in Sunday school. So I think that a lot of Arabs and Muslims, have to contend with this complicated history of rise and fall.
And I know I'm getting kind of nitpicky here with the history, and we won't spend a long time on this, but since you say it's such a momentous, historical event, the Six-Day War, do you mind just doing a quick recap of that for maybe people who aren't sure what happened there? I mean, if you're saying that it completely, switched the mentality from to one of kind of despair, it kind of sounds like.
Well, so it's very rare to have wars that only last 6 days. So even the name of the war is kind of a humiliation. And keep in mind that there were several Arab armies that were involved. And I'm trying to think what the population in Egypt would have been at the time. Maybe somewhere around 40 million. And Israel might have been around, I don't know, like 4 million or something like that, give or take. So for a relatively small state, and Israel at that time was barely 20 years old. So we're talking about a young state that doesn't have a large population being able to defeat not only the Egyptian army, but several other armies. And, just how is that even possible? So you have Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and they get destroyed by the Israeli army. So it's hard for me to even think of a comparable war that represents such utter defeat from and the much larger group that represents the much larger population is the one that suffers that defeat. I'm sure there are other examples, but the fact that they're not really ones that we can think of very quickly shows us how rare this kind of failure, this kind of military failure is. So then if you go through that military failure, then you start to ask yourself, wait, was there something deeper in our society that was decayed, that was falling apart? Because what could explain a military failure except some deeper societal failure? Something went wrong. And I think that's the best way to look at what happened is, when we face failure, when we face defeat, and this applies to nations, but it also applies to individuals. So we can relate to this on an individual level. If we go through something really bad in our own lives, at some point we got to sit down and try to make sense of why and how it happened.
So do you think that this is what you're referencing, this what sounds like a moral struggle since then. Is that what you reference in the subtitle of your book? Which is, and I'll let you.
Yeah, sure. So the subtitle is How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. So, I mean, 1967 is an important part of the story, but there are a number of other dates, and I think that it can sometimes, we don't necessarily want to get too focused on one date because this is a very long history. In my book, I try to cover about 14 centuries of history, so I gotta, that's a lot to cover. But 67, 1924. Obviously, the founding moment of Islam is very critical to this very day because you can't understand a religion without understanding its founding moment.
But it's
sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say it sounds like what we just talked about, the fall of the caliphate, the 6-Day War, this what seemed like what sounds like a forceful secularization, that this has kind of resulted in the struggle today. I think the culmination of everything we just talked about is that I think is that what you're referencing?
Exactly. It all leads to this ongoing struggle over the role of Islam. And people still can't agree on that. And that's in part what people are fighting over. So, basically there's two ways of dealing with this. One is to say that, that Muslims have to get over this and find a way to secularize, and that's the only ultimate solution. The other approach is to say that if Islam plays this outsized role in public life, then we have to come to terms with that role, and we have to, in some sense, accommodate or find a place for Islam in public life. Now, this can be difficult for us as Americans because we may not be comfortable. We might say, well, we're secular. We think it's better for religion to be more private. So one thing that I always try to emphasize when I talk about this is it's good to separate our own personal preferences and personal biases from what we think is appropriate for a different region in the world. And it's ultimately up to the people who live in these countries to decide how they want to live, right? So if they want to have a larger role for Islam in public life, within reason, we're not talking about, I think when people hear larger role for Islam in public life, they automatically think Iran or some brutal theocracy. That's not correct. There are different interpretations of Islamic law. Some are more conservative, some are more progressive, some are more accommodating of pluralism and freedom. Others are more restrictive. So there's a wide array of options there. But generally, most of the polling that we have suggests that significant majorities in most Middle Eastern countries, as well as in South and Southeast Asia, want to see a significant role for Islam. So if they express that through the democratic process peacefully, and they vote for parties that represent those views, I think that we as Americans have to have at least some deference for those preferences instead of saying you have to be more like us. We're liberal, we're secular. You got to transform into us. So that's how I think about a potential resolution to this struggle, right? It's not going to be easy. And one thing, and it's dark, but the first, the title of the first chapter of the book is "To Take Joy in a Massacre," and I talk about these very vivid images that I saw and that I in some sense was a part of in the lead up to what was the worst massacre in modern Egyptian history, which happened on August 14th, 2013. And I try to use this massacre to understand how Egyptians could turn against each other, because Egypt doesn't really have a history of civil war or of violent conflict between citizens. Usually it's the state repressing its citizens. But here we have people turning against each other, and that was very frightening. And there's a personal element here because I was in Egypt in the week leading up to the massacre. I left Egypt on August 12th, 2013. The killings happened on August 14th. So, and that's crazy to think that I was actually living in a country that was building up to this very dark moment. And the more personal element is, as I mentioned, because I'm originally Egyptian, that most of my family supported the mass killings against the Muslim Brotherhood. They hate the Muslim Brotherhood, and they supported the military when it was cracking down and when it went into this square in broad daylight and just used live ammunition and killed about 1,000 people in just the span of hours. So then I tried to make sense of this. How is it possible that people who are dear to me, that I love, that I've known for such a long time, and I think they're otherwise good people, right? But these otherwise good people came to support, in my view, an evil thing.
And
this is always
what was this exactly?
Yeah. So after the military coup, which happened in July 2013, so as I mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. President Mohamed Morsi, who just passed away recently in prison, in court while he was being tried, Mohamed Morsi became president. He's a senior figure. He was a senior figure in the Muslim Brotherhood.
And this was in Egypt, right?
Egypt, yeah. So you had democratic elections. The Muslim Brotherhood does well. It wins. It comes to power. It wins not just one election, but actually several elections. And then there's a large number of Egyptians who don't like the Brotherhood. From 2012 to 2013, we see growing polarization where Egyptians come to see each other as enemies, in part because they disagree over these fundamental existential issues having to do with religion. They see the Brotherhood as a party that will change the nature of the state and make Egypt into some kind of religious regime. So you have secular and even just ordinary Egyptians of different stripes seeing the Brotherhood as a threat. So you have people can debate how divided the country was. It might have been 50-50, 60-40, something like that. But my family most of my family in Egypt tends to represent what might be called the secular elite. They're very suspicious of these religious parties. And that's one reason that they felt that these mass killings were justified, because they said, I thought this was very unfortunate that they said this, but we got in these debates when I was in Egypt that year, that the Brotherhood, they were afraid that if the Brotherhood stayed in power, that it would keep on winning elections, it would gain more power, and that it would transform the country. And they said, well, democracy is nice in theory, but we're the ones who have to live with the consequences of elections. So you Americans, and they see me primarily as an American who has no right to speak about Egypt. So this led to a lot of tension in the broader family, because they would say, well, you're born and raised in America, you're an American citizen. Why are you coming and telling us that we have to respect democratic elections when you're not the one who has to live with the consequences of those elections? And actually, I think that you hear this in a lot of places beyond the Middle East, where people, if they see a party that wins that they don't like, also there's a fire truck in the background.
That's okay. I think we've had a few on our end too.
So, we have this too, where like if Donald Trump wins, people say, well, oh, he's not legitimate, or we want to get rid of him by any means because, yeah, he may have gotten elected through democratic means, but he's so bad and he's such a threat to America and our values as Americans that we don't care about the democratic process anymore. And that's why my experiences in the Middle East inform how I view American politics, in the way we talk about the rise of right-wing populists in Europe, or the rise of Hindu nationalism in India, or Duterte in the Philippines. This is happening throughout the world, where the real test of your commitment to democracy is whether you're willing to respect democratic outcomes, even when people you hate or fear come to power through democratic means. I'm a big believer that even if you hate someone or you hate a party that wins freely and fairly, you can fight that through the ballot box, and you can try to persuade your fellow citizens to have a different view, but you can't undo the results of the ballot box, because once you do that, there's no way to resolve differences peacefully. Because one of the great things about democracy, I would argue, is that it may not be perfect, but it's the only way to resolve differences peacefully. Otherwise, you resort to coercion, force, violence, and repression. There's no other way.
So what was the resistance to the election of the Muslim Brotherhood? Can you talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and why there was such a negative reaction with that? I mean, I hear of the Muslim Brotherhood here and there, but usually it's, in some headline or, probably not in the best light. So you probably know more than I do.
Sure. So, I think the first thing to say is that the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamist movement, and we talked about what that word means previously. But then we can also talk about extremist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda also falling under the Islamist rubric. This leads to a lot of confusion because sometimes people want to lump these groups together as all being bad or whatever. I think it's very important to draw careful distinctions. ISIS is a completely different group than the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, ISIS considers the Muslim Brotherhood.
Oh, shoot. Shadi, we had it cut off there. And I think what you were saying was probably really important. Do you mind saying that again? The difference between ISIS and.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So I think it's important to make careful distinctions between a group like ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood, because ISIS is quite different in important respects. I mean, first of all, ISIS considers the Brotherhood to be apostates. In other words, they're not real Muslims because they don't actually follow Islamic law in a strict way, right? So, but to kind of go into some of the differences, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the vast majority of places it operates, is nonviolent. It believes in peaceful participation. It believes in participating in the parliamentary process. So in a number of different countries, Muslim Brotherhood movements or parties that are linked to the Muslim Brotherhood have representation in parliament. And if you look at a group like ISIS doesn't believe in elected parliaments because they believe that God is the sole lawgiver. And if you have a parliament, that means parliament is taking on the role of God by passing laws, basically. So this is one of the fundamental differences. And obviously, ISIS is violent and uses not just violent, but uses terrorism against innocent civilians in many parts of the world, as we know. So it just doesn't make sense to really compare these groups. Now, in terms of what actually happened when the Brotherhood came to power, there's a lot of disagreement among Egyptians about how to interpret that year. Also, a year isn't a very long time. I would say that the Brotherhood used some very problematic rhetoric. So the Brotherhood is not liberal. They don't believe in classical liberalism. They don't necessarily believe in the full extent of the American Bill of Rights. They believe in some restrictions according to religion. They do have problematic views historically on the role of minorities. And naturally, if you want your state to be more Islamically oriented, it does call into question what the role of Christians is going to be. Can you have a Christian president who's leading an ostensibly Islamic state or an Islamically influenced state? How would that really work? So naturally, the Christian minority population in Egypt became very fearful when the Muslim Brotherhood was elected, and they were worried about what might happen. And there was also quite problematic. I would say that the most problematic things were on the level of rhetoric. It's not as if the Brotherhood forced Christians out or passed laws that took away freedoms from Christians. Now, there was a fear that if the Brotherhood stayed in power, they would move more in that direction. And that's why it became very difficult to have rational, reasonable conversation about the Muslim Brotherhood, because my family members, for example, their fears were mostly in the future. And how can you have a fact-based conversation about something that hasn't happened yet? They can say, well, of course, anything is possible. I would say that there were limits to what the Brotherhood could do in power because the military was still extremely powerful, and the Brotherhood didn't have full control over the Egyptian state, over the Egyptian bureaucracy. And this is where the term deep state was used a lot in Egypt, and we actually use it now in the US, or at least Republicans sometimes do. They're actually taking it from Egypt and Turkey, this idea that if someone is elected and they're the president, they don't have full power because the deep state or the bureaucracy or is undermining the president. So that you'll hear that sometimes in respect to Donald Trump and the bureaucracy and the American bureaucracy. In the case of Egypt, there was a very strong sense, and I think that the facts were certainly in this direction, that Mohammed Morsi and the Brotherhood did not have full control of the state. So my argument would be, well, yes, you're fearful, but instead of getting rid of the Brotherhood through violence, try to win through the ballot box, because the Brotherhood was losing some popular support because the economic situation was also not going well in 2013. But I think the most important thing was the fear of what would come in the future. And also the fear of things like changes when it came to women's rights. So the Brotherhood doesn't have a great record on women's rights. They are a conservative religious party that has a more traditional Orthodox view of what men's role is in society and what women's role is. So that was another part of a debate where there was a fear from some of my, on the part of my family members, that that women in Egypt would feel pressure to wear the headscarf. So I would say, well, the Brotherhood isn't seriously going to pass a law requiring women to wear the headscarf. No one was really talking about that. The Brotherhood never actually proposed that when it was in power. But then they would say, well, okay, fine, Shadi, but there would be pressure on them to wear the headscarf. But that's a hard thing to measure, right? And that's not the full and that's more of a societal problem, that Egyptian society is religiously conservative. So yes, there is pressure in terms of society for women to wear the headscarf. So these were some of the concerns, that the Brotherhood would exacerbate or empower some of these more conservative, so-called these conservative fundamentalist tendencies in Egyptian society, and they weren't willing to let that continue. So they wanted to put an end to that, and that's where there was a lot of support for the military coup in July 2013 happened, and then in the days leading up to the military coup, the Muslim Brotherhood set up a protest site in the middle of Cairo. And then after the coup happened, they stayed there, tens of thousands of people, and saying that they would not leave the square until Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood was reinstated. So they wanted to basically undo the military coup. Obviously, the military wasn't going to agree to that. So the military said that they threatened to move into the square. They ultimately did, and that led to the mass killing.
Has Egypt been a democracy since?
No. So, I mean, as you can imagine, after something as violent as that, you can't really recover from that, and that created a lot of some deep wounds in Egyptian society that I think Egyptians will be contending with for decades to come. That's part now of the historical memory, and you can't undo a massacre once it happens, obviously. Now, when the coup happened in July 2013, there were many Egyptians who supported the coup, who said that the new military figure, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is now the president of Egypt, that he would restore democracy in quotation marks. And even Secretary of State John Kerry said this after the coup, that Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is restoring democracy. What we know about military coups, though, especially if it's a military coup against an elected government, that sets a very dangerous precedent of not respecting the verdict of the ballot box. And as I think I argued at the time, unfortunately, it turned out to be true. This became the most brutal, repressive regime in Egyptian history. So we're talking about well over 40,000 people imprisoned. As I mentioned, well over 1,000 people killed, political parties banned, sham elections. So in one of the recent elections, it was like 97% to 3%. So they're not even pretending, because sometimes when you want to pretend that the election is somewhat competitive, you kind of let the opposition have maybe 10% or 15%. But in this case, they only let the opposition have 3%, and it wasn't even a real opposition. So Egypt now is something close to, I would say something close to a totalitarian state, that family members inform on each other. You have to be careful about what you say in private. So this is part of a broader story of the rise and fall of the Arab Spring. And Egypt is a very sad case. And, for someone like me who was in Tahrir Square during the revolution, and this was, and just to kind of look back at this for a second, February 11th, 2011, a lot of Americans might remember this, the beautiful images from Tahrir Square of people, protesting and staying in the square, basically living in the square. You had this basically like tent city in a very festive atmosphere, because people felt that freedom was close. And ultimately, I was in Tahrir Square when the announcement came that the longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak was going to step down. And it was a beautiful moment to see Egyptians in the hundreds of thousands of people, just their level of excitement and joy and jubilation. So it's important to remember that there was this very exciting moment, and a lot of Americans became excited for Arabs, because we as Americans tended to look at the Arab world as a place where nothing positive happens. But now finally something positive was happening.
And the celebration was over the supposed success of a democratic election.
No, an election hadn't happened yet. It was just a revolution at that time.
Oh, gotcha.
It was about getting rid of the authoritarian leader, Hosni Mubarak. Elections happened later that year. So elections came pretty quickly after that. So all of this was part of the Arab Spring environment that I think many of us remember. But it's important to remember that moment of happiness and excitement, because it turned bad very quickly, not just in Egypt, but also in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen. So throughout the region, we see conflict, we see violence, we see destabilization. So this is a broader tragedy, and I think that so part of the story is the tragedy of the Arab Spring, but if we want to look at it more broadly, part of understanding that tragedy it goes back to the struggle over religion. That when people disagree over, let's say, policy issues like economic things, that's easier to resolve because it's numerical. You can sit down with someone and you can split the middle on economic issues. But how do you split the middle on things that are in your heart, that have to do with the deepest questions of faith? It becomes much more difficult to compromise on that.
So what do you think this means, that there seems like such a struggle between those that want democracy and want respect for a democratic electoral process, like you, even if that means that there are parties in power that you don't like. But then that is met with resistance for those who are much more forceful for the power that they want, or whoever they want in charge. This is such a struggle between so many different types of mentalities and groups within the Middle East, and it seems like within, Islamic communities. So what do you think, what does this mean? I mean, what does this mean for like the spectrum of where people are at within either their faith or their belief systems? And what does this mean just like, on a political, socioeconomic, situation? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, sure. So I think that if we're looking at it as Americans, we can look back at the record of the last 6 decades where the US unfortunately has pretty consistently supported authoritarian regimes. And we kind of turned a blind eye to the 2013 military coup to some extent as well under Obama. And obviously under Trump, there's even more of a doubling down in support for dictatorships and to like not care about democracy and human rights. Now, we can look and say we've had some variation of this pro-dictator policy for several decades now. Has it led to a better Middle East? And I think the answer to that is clear, no. And I have a bias, and it's also as a political scientist, most political scientists tend to think that in the long run, democracies are better on a whole host of indicators. And I think the evidence is pretty strong on that. Now, democracy in the short term can be destabilizing. It can be scary and frightening because, there's uncertainty that you're introducing into the political system. So I don't want to pretend that democracy is some kind of panacea where everything turns out perfectly. We as Americans know in our current context right now that we're struggling as Americans, and there's a lot of uncertainty about where things might go, if Trump is reelected, to give an example. So you have to have some tolerance for uncertainty, right? So that's where I come out on this, that the only long-term way to accommodate people of different religious persuasions is to have free debate and free inquiry. And that may mean that more religious conservatives have a place in the public arena, and they're going to be vocal. They're going to try to push their ideas, and those ideas are going to be scary. But their role has to be protected. They should not be repressed. Just as people who have a very secular view, who want to see less of a role for religion, their rights should also be protected. But that can only happen in the context of democracy and democratic competition. So there has to be some kind of mutual accommodation where secularists or liberals on one hand in the Middle East and Islamists on the other hand say that they don't like each other. They might even hate each other. They might disagree with each other on fundamental questions of religion, but they have to find a way to live together because there's no way that one side is going to defeat the other. And if one side does defeat the other, that's going to mean a lot of violence and a lot of repression, and that's not sustainable, and it's also morally abhorrent in my view.
How many countries in the Middle East are actually democratic right now? Like actually democratic?
Actually democratic. Tunisia is the lone bright spot of the Arab Spring. Iraq and Lebanon are flawed in various ways, and obviously Iraq has had civil war and civil conflict for many years now. But at least relatively speaking, there is a democratic process. There is a respect for democratic outcomes. Lebanon did have a civil war. Luckily, it hasn't reverted to civil war in quite some time, but it's flawed in a number of ways. But I would say, so Tunisia, Iraq, Lebanon to various degrees. Israel, if obviously not Arab, but is in some sense part of the Middle East. Turkey used to be more democratic. It's losing some of it. It's losing quite a bit of its democratic character under the authoritarian streak of President Erdogan. There are some positive signs that just happened recently in a major local election in Istanbul where the opposition figure actually won. And that could actually show that Turkey still has some potential to hold on to its democratic character. But those are pretty much the more positive cases. So in other words, not a lot.
And in these countries, can everyone vote? Are women allowed to vote? Minorities? Are there any restrictions? In other words, I mean, is it truly democratic?
There are no restrictions. There were previous cases where in Kuwait, but this was this must have been sometime, I think, in the early 2000s where it was changed, but where women did not have the right to vote in Kuwait, but then they were granted the right to vote. Um, but that's in, the Gulf is a little bit different, where it's significantly more conservative than the rest of the Middle East. But in the countries that I mentioned, it's universal suffrage. Now, there's corruption, there's cronyism. It's not a perfect electoral process, but everyone has the right to vote in those countries.
So, what do you think would need to happen for the rest of the areas, or even the countries you just stated, where you say, they're democratic, but they're still deeply flawed? What do you think should happen that can allow democratic processes to shine through more
Yeah.
and more effectively?
Well, I think first of all, we have to be patient as outside observers, and we have to get away from this idea that democracy is something that happens overnight. So this is also, I feel like, the way Egyptians viewed things in the from 2011 to 2013, because revolutions raise expectations so high. People then automatically assume that the economy is going to get better, but that's not the way real life works. So I think we have to keep when we talk about revolution, when we talk about democratic change, we got to be careful about setting expectations. Democracy is a generational process. And let's remember from our own history, it's a bit of a cliche by now, but, we went through our own civil war, and that happened many decades after our founding, after our independence. So that should help us remember that countries will go through civil conflict. There will be extreme levels of polarization, but the answer is not to revert to dictatorship. Was the answer in the American context for us to revert to dictatorship? I don't think any American would argue that, because we're proud that we continued to believe in a democratic process and that we were willing to fight for that. That's not something that you can, or should, I should say, should give up on just in the span of 3, 4, or even 10 years. So that's, I think, one way of thinking about this more broadly. Democracy is not something you give up on, and also that we, again, if we're thinking about this as our role as Americans, we have something to account for, because we have a tragic history of doing a lot of bad things in the Middle East. I talked about support for dictatorship. There's also, I think, support for Israeli repression of Palestinians and Palestinians not having the most basic rights that we as Americans hold dear, and that we should want others to hold as well. But also things like the Iraq War that had a very detrimental effect on the broader region. So we have a lot of sins to atone for. And my hope, and one reason that I do what I do, and that I care deeply about my work, is that I believe that it's possible for the U.S. to have a more constructive approach to the Middle East. And I think that we're going to have some of these debates in 2020 in the election campaign. And I think the Democratic nominees are going to have some different views about how we rethink our relationships in the Middle East. So, for example, Saudi Arabia has been doing some very bad things in the region. Egypt has been doing, as we've talked about, some very bad things within its own borders. Should we rethink our relationships with these bad allies that don't align with our values and they don't align with our interests? So that's a conversation. Those are the kinds of conversations I think that we have to have.
Do you think that, because you talked about what Islamism is, what an Islamist is, and you said that it's essentially the belief that social and also political life should be guided by Islamic principles.
Yeah.
The key term in there being also the public life. Do you think that has a lot to do with the struggle of implementing democratic processes successfully? Because we didn't, in America at least, in a lot of Western countries, there's the foundation that we started with of separation between church and state that I'm guessing probably made that a little bit easier of a.
So
Go ahead.
yeah, so this I think makes it more challenging, because these questions around religion complicate the democratic process. They raise the stakes, and people are afraid of democratic outcomes. We didn't have quite the same. I mean, we had fear of democratic outcomes in our own history, but those were over things like slavery, and although there was a religious element to some of those debates, it wasn't primarily about religion or religious faith or the role of religion in public life. So in that sense, the Middle East is going to be more challenging than what we've dealt with in at least in our recent history. But we've been through a lot, and again, we went through a civil war. That is not an easy thing to get past. Now, I would also make a distinction between separation of church and state and separation of religion from politics. We as Americans have the former, but we don't have the latter. In other words, there is still respect for public religiosity in American life. Unlike in, say, much of Western Europe, which is much more secular in the public sphere. And that's actually one major advantage I think that the U.S. has, and one thing that we should be very proud of. We don't tell Christian evangelicals or Orthodox Jews or conservative Muslims to choose between their religious identity and their American identity, because those two should be able to go hand in hand. But the only way they can go hand in hand is if we guarantee a certain respect for religion's role. So we shouldn't be saying to Christian evangelicals that they have to keep their religion in the home or in the private sphere. That's not who we are as Americans. And we are a country founded on religious freedom. We're founded on a sense of giving safe haven to those who are affected by religious persecution. So we can't go and say that if we don't like someone's religious beliefs, that we're going to limit their religious expression. We can't and shouldn't do that. And that's a major advantage that we have over European democracies, where there's much less openness to the role of religion in public life.
So in talking about Islamism and the desire for private and public life to be guided by Islamic principles, you're saying that doesn't necessarily mean it has to shine through in policies and governing. It's just a motivation for how you might vote, say, if it was a democratic process.
Yeah, that can certainly be part of it, that people are motivated and that can be an inspiration to them, but it may not always result in specific policies. And that just depends on what the policy process produces. I mean, let's say you have an Islamist party that wasn't able to form a majority government and it has to have a coalition with secular parties. That's going to temper what an Islamist party can do in power, right? And that's what happened in Tunisia from about 2000, well, actually, from 2011 to 2013, when the Islamist party won the most votes, but not enough votes to govern alone. So it formed a coalition government. And that imposed limitations on what the Islamist party could do. Also, if an Islamist party doesn't do well in government, then a more secular party can win in the next election. So there are different ways of looking at this. There's not just one predetermined outcome. And also that even if you have different, let's say we're looking at different Islamist parties in different countries, some of them are more or less conservative than the others. So we can't say that there's one common approach that all of these parties uphold. That's not true. And the way that Islamism, or even Islam more broadly, is expressed in Indonesia or Malaysia is very different than how it's expressed in Tunisia. And I think that it's important to never talk about Islam as being just one thing. Obviously, Islam is one thing as a religion that has certain set theological principles. But beyond those principles, there's an incredible level of variation across history, across time, and across place. And that is always worth, I think, remembering when we're trying to ask ourselves, well, what might happen in a particular democratic process? We don't always know. And that's why it's really important to let those processes play out.
Well, I feel like I say this with every episode, with every guest, but Shadi, I feel like there's so much more we could talk about and go in depth on. So we'll have to have you back in another time. But I know, our time is cut a little short here. Is there anything else that you would like to say or go over real quick that you feel like we didn't quite cover?
Yeah, I think that covers the major things that I was looking forward to talking about. And I'll just say, thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Oh, thank you so much. Like I said, we'll have to have you back another time.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Shadi.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.